Hi there, it's Chris from Airwindows, and welcome to the Q&A stream, which is what I do on Mondays at 11. It's like 11:01, but I'm sure that's fine. And what we're going to do is bring in the chat window with Bo. Hey, Bo. And I have to fool around with my controls and settings a little bit so that I can see said chat window. So we'll just do that. And yeah. So hey. On Sunday, I put out a plugin called Tape, which is actually for the third time. And how have I been? Reasonably okay. I've not been feeling well, but another friend of mine is very sensitive to allergies, and he's like, "Oh, dude, the trees are going bonkers right now." And I'm like, "Fair enough, okay." So, my general wellness has not been great. The wellness of Airwindows has been fantastic. We're going to go for an hour and 42 minutes or slightly more because of how strong that's working. But I have to physically keep up with it, or at least physically keep up. I suppose that it's not necessarily a thing of like, oh, people threw more money, therefore I have to do commensurately more stuff, although I'm willing to tie it to the time that I spent on these videos and streams and things. I'm doing my music thing, and that's how I get ideas and stuff. And I can spend more time on that, and I can spend more time on the Q&A. Although it depends upon, oh, and here's another thing. I have to remember to do something else. Excuse me for a second. I have promised that I would do a social media post. So that's me doing your basic social media posts. And there, at this point, we might have people showing up and saying, hello. I got like 3 people, at least those that I can see. Hey, Ahmed. So yeah, I think maybe one of the things that we can talk about is what kinds of stuff I put attention towards going forwards. Because like I said on the video, I'm keeping the plugins happening. And yet there's also other things that interest me, which I will end up doing. So it's a question of like how much I talk about that. Ahmed says, it's darker out there, Chris. Oh, check out how dark it gets. Wow, it's really dark in here. It's so dark. Now that's just a camera settings thing. And I don't have all my lights on. And it's only the question and answer stream, so it's not a blaze of glory time. Well, maybe it's a blaze of glory time, hard to tell. So some of the stuff that I've been focusing on, like I can tell you all the stuff I've been doing in recent days, and that'll give you some idea of the challengingness of being Chris from Airwindows and doing this sort of thing. It's chai tea, by the way. I can't be hammering too much coffee. It's not good for me. I have recently tried a new streaming technique where I'm using the software X264 compressor rather than trying to use the Apple hardware one. This causes my poor little iMac to stress out and run too hard, but I did improve its cooling. That's in one of my Instagram posts. Is this a picture of a iMac with sort of foam rubber around the bottom edge of it, which only works if you have, as I showed also in the picture, a hole in your desk. If you have a hole in your desk, then you can draw air in from underneath there and put the air out using the little iMac's ventilation things on top of the desk, meaning that it isn't sucking in its own exhaust fumes. Not that it makes fumes, but its own heated exhaust air. And running the software renderer stresses out the iMac, and it makes its little fan go on, which is annoying if you're doing music, but it doesn't crash the stream, and that is valuable in its own way. So I tested that out on the Minecraft thing. I was also building another thing, which was converting a clock into a Eurorack module. It was this kit that I built that was just LEDs, and my purpose there was to make the clock in such a way that I could read voltages off of the pins and get control voltages that changed once a second or whatever, which I kind of sort of did, and then within one day took it apart and broke it and did something else after having made you can see also on the Instagram is where I post these little technical experiments, that I made a fairly nifty little device out of that. And then in trying to further work on it and do other things, parts of it broke off because it's made out of this perf board, which is fragile. And I basically deconstructed it completely. So that was hours and hours of work, which also involved making too many solder fumes, which was also not good for my state of health. And then it became useless because it's a complicated story about how the voltage is generated, but that was a digital clock that was generated through the there was a particular 3 different little LED thingies, and it scanned through all 3. So any given one, you were able to read one of the pins off of it, but it scanned through all 3 and only turned any given one on a third of the time. What makes matters worse is that the way of shutting off or turning on the LEDs that were being used was, I think, on the output of those circuits, meaning that you couldn't read directly off of the LED and just average that out with its third of the time versus 0, because the voltages at the pins of the LED were always all 3 options, and it's the drain voltage that was being switched to a connection to ground or whatever a third of the time. So I started working on this after realizing I started working on this before I realized that the work that I was trying to do was going to be useless because of the way that it was constructed. So I broke it for no good reason, and the one thing that I was able to get it to do, you will not be seeing me do because it's broken and gone and it is not working anymore. And that was a couple of days. And then I did the tape thing and was working on the that lookup table. This is what happens when I'm not well, is I will be chasing trains of thought and have too many things to keep track of, and people complain loudly about this, and I can't help them because I'm stuck in this head, and these are the thoughts that I'm stuck on, and I'm not able to do anything different. It's not that I'm able to not do some of these things when I'm engaged with them. I'm going to drink a little more chai tea. That might help. But drawing the watercolor palette that I drew and then making a lookup table based on that, which is the one you're seeing now. This slightly desaturated look is pretty color accurate for everything that you see on camera. And that is using the watercolor palette lookup table. And that was more hours of work doing that. First making it, taking the photograph in full sunlight with my lights going at the same time, and then editing it in several different programs, which ended up being Affinity Photo for the lookup table editing, so that I could get that working. Another couple of hours there. And what you do is you take a picture, for instance, the picture of this palette, or a picture of just me off of the camera raw, and put it into an image, and then you take the default lookup table image that you get, which is these little squares in varying colors, and you paste that in the bottom of the image, and then you adjust the entire image with tone mapping controls, like the Affinity Photo tone mapping personas. And it's not, you can't like do visual editing that's like ripple effects or whatever, but you can do the craziest imaginable things in tone mapping. And what you do in the regular image is also going to be mimicked in the lookup table square that you've also pasted onto the image, as long as you stick within tone mapping and everything is just in RGB and you're not moving any of the pixels anywhere. And so I got together some of that stuff and made it so that I could demonstrate it a little bit in the tape video. And there's some more stuff that I need to do as far as doing some of the insaner ones, because what you can do is copy and paste the overall image, and then you'd start using overlay modes, like this image overlaid on top of itself with the overlay mode, and that intensifies everything kind of insanely. Or multiply mode, you've just made everything dark. Or you can do tone mapping type selections, which is something that I did with some of that stuff. You select all the bright colors and make them more blue, for instance, or all, dark colors blue is the blue-orange thing that people do. And as long as you are selecting areas of tonality before doing your craziness, then it will translate into the lookup table thing. I see people are talking about cracks and soothe and stuff, so that's fine. So I haven't yet done that, but I'm moving in the direction of it. And I started out in the tape upload version by at least uploading a clip to the finalized watercolor picture, which again is going to be very uninteresting to many people. Preston has a real question, just a moment. It's going to be very uninteresting to many people, but the thing is, if you load it up in a graphics editor, those are little color swatches that you can paint with, and that's the whole purpose of that. So I'm going to be digging into that a little bit as well. Now let me scan over what people are chatting, because it's been Bo and Ahmed chatting about a whole bunch of things. I did ask, can you make a gain writer? Be careful what you ask for, Serge. Serge, Buttercomp, try things to do, you don't have to just ask me. Compression, yes. Other people are making soothes, fine. Other people can make soothes. I don't think it's a good thing. Preston's asking, can you have unlinked compressors in Airwindows for dual mono purposes? Depends on the kind. Like in Logic, you can load stuff up as stereo or dual mono. I'm pretty sure there are ways of hosting things where you can have stuff in dual mono, and there are things like MV, which is a reverb, not a compressor, that is designed to be dual mono. So if I code up a compressor specifically to be unlinked, then it will be. The reason this doesn't happen very much with me is because I start out on audio units, and if you code audio unit as end-to-end means only one channel, but it copies that channel as many times as you need. So if you have like a 5.1 track, then it'll give you 6 different channels for your full surround plus the subwoofer, and it'll apply the same effect on all of them. That's what end-to-end means. Or if you had a quad channel, it would apply the channel in quad. Or if you have a stereo channel, which is much more common, then it will load up the dual copies, independent copies of the effect on each channel. So all of the audio unit end-to-end stuff already defaults to dual mono. And if I'm doing anything in stereo in audio units, it's usually because I want to do something else. And very commonly with compressors, you want to do something else. It's not as often to find situations where you want compressors to be unlinked. There's also an additional problem, which is that without a wider range of controls available, then the only unlinker that you can do is a full-on slider, and you put it to like 1 for unlinked or 0 for linked or something like that. There's ways of doing things like that. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Or that's to some extent where I'm at, because I honestly don't think I was talking about all of the stuff that I've been on about. Let me have a quick peek at some of my notes. Look at me rotating my camera around. There we go. So these are some of my notes of stuff that I've been doing recently. As you can see, I'm constantly generating these little cards. It's much like this. It's very similar to the card with the pigments on it. This one, what's on these notes, is at the top is a Control-Shift-B Boolean menu. That is a note for Blender. And there's some code words here that are characters that I'd like to model in Blender. Basically, I wrote a program in the Godot engine that generates these spheres in Blender scripting engine. So I have ways of algorithmically writing programs that generate stuff, and it's generating stuff in Blender scripting, but I'm able to use a full like 3D engine / computer program to think out and sort of draw in 2D that kind of stuff without actually having to render it. I see we're getting a few more comments here. I have mentioned W and E move and rotate keys. I don't know whether that's Blender or a Substance Designer. I had that, a Substance Painter, and I found that it was unbearable because it was equally frustrating UI-wise as Blender, but a completely different interface at the same time. And I made notes of Blender and the equivalent Blender controls for popular ZBrush things. So it's like standard is the same as draw is the same as your standard, and ZBrush, apparently you can get a lot out of a clay buildup brush, which adds material in a certain way that is useful. And the Blender equivalent is clay strips. Not just clay, but specifically clay strips is apparently the one you want. And then there's one called Dam Standard, which in Blender is crease, and Trim Dynamic in Blender it's scrape. It's not flatten, it's scrape. So I'm making notes of all these things as I start fooling with it. You know, Trim Dynamic, and then Move is grab, and a Smooth is smooth. And sometimes you want to subdivide manually. You don't always use Dynamesh. And these are things I've been learning when I try to pick up that skill set. And I made some notes on Substance Paint, like option left click is rotate and option command left click is translate, and it's like, oh my God, who came up with this stuff? And I had to figure out how to get nodes working in Blender, which there's a shader editor that lets you have a node view for the kinds of things that you have designed in there. And then I made a few notes on, I'll get back to the couple of questions that we've got building up. But I'll build up questions, otherwise I'm just going to talk about the things that I do all day. My remaining note is something that I've started to do because it's something that I want to add to my usual workflow. And that is, says music jams, grab video image into Clip Studio Paint, title, album cover, name, SoundCloud image, save Clip Studio, go back and change YouTube stream image and export JPEG, which has to be less than 2 megs in size. Basically, the idea there is I would like to up some of my music jam things a little bit, especially since people started to take an interest in like coronavirus quarantined modular synthesizer ambient music. There was a clickbaity site that ran a little article on that, and I was like, oh hey, if they're running a little article on that and they have a search for YouTube for people who are reading this article to go and look at, although most people aren't going to bother going there, but if they do, the stuff that I make, and I only got about 3,000 or so viewers or anything like that, but it's on the top, like scroll down about 5 pages and my thing shows up there. So I thought what I should do is, rather than, because here's another thing that I did on a lot of these things on SoundCloud, what I've been doing is loading up these images that are created on another computer, because there is a program that I don't remember the name of right now that's like random background image generator, and I don't remember any of the names that is associated with this right now. I'm really pretty fried. I'm usually pretty fried, so unless people want to give me a big vacation, you're just going to have to live with it. I'm not able to think very well. But this random graphic generation thing, you get to specify certain colors and it'll make these sort of computer generated looking, they'd make good ambient album covers. They make good sort of synthetic looking album covers, and it just generates this stuff and sets the background to that. But you can also do that while setting the background while saving them to a folder. So I ran that for like a few days until I had an enormous pile of these sort of abstract computer generated backgrounds. Again, I don't remember the name of the system that did it, and it doesn't run on modern computers, but I run an older computer for the coding, so I do that. I see that the last thing was, Bo, please get back to me. I value your opinion. So what I was going to do is do the music jams, and then immediately after finishing them, go and look at the video and find some likely moment in the entire jam. Just scan through until the colors are looking right, because I'm using those lights for the color and stuff like that. And I'll find some likely moment, blow it up, screenshot it, open it up in Clip Studio Paint, which I'm learning to paint in. And I've set things up so that using those pigment, the pigment image that I made, I have several different brushes doing different things. Like there's a normal brush, and there's one that I've set up that is more like a watercolor painter brush, and it's in the multiply mode. So if I take light tints of white and overlay with them, I should be able to get fairly accurate color mixing, because I'm not using just computer-based color mixing. Plus, I'm going to have more natural colors because I'm not using just computer-based colors. They're all going to be within a restricted gamut. And my hope is that I can get a look out of this kind of stuff. I can do all kinds of things like a very large airbrush or small detail type things, or I can have a brush that lets me write notes in or write a title for the thing in by hand lettering. And if I do sort of an album cover, just try something out like that, I can save it as Clip Studio Paint, and that means that I'll have a full resolution. Oh, by the way, Clip Studio Paint lets you draw in vector very, very, very nicely. So if I learn how to do that, I can do sketching and lettering and things, and it's high resolution, like it could scale up to any size. And Clip Studio Paint lets you save stuff with layers like that, so I'll have a master that includes a bitmap image, which is a screenshot, and that's okay. I'll just work with that. And then other stuff on top of it, much like Adobe, whatever the Adobe Publisher thing is that I had to use back when I was making an album and getting it printed up at disc makers. And I had to use whatever the Adobe program was to handle that, where they let you have certain amounts of bitmap, and then you've also got vector layers and you've got text layers and stuff. And they're all separate, and you're sending them to prepress, and they can print it up real nicely. Well, Clip Studio does things kind of like that too. So the idea is, I'm doing this music thing because it's not necessarily just about, on this day, can I be so inspired that I do the great music that's the best music? Instead, it's, and this is worth listening to, even though this is going to be a weird day of just me ranting until my voice fails and my lungs fall off. The music things that I do are a techno / house / trance, whatever, beat-oriented music. And then also, and don't retract, if you retract things, I can't actually answer them. And it takes me a really long time to see you in the first place, so that's always a bummer. Those days are sit down before 11 and start working and do something. And having done this for some years now, I've gotten it to the point where generally I'm kind of doing what I meant. Like, I'm doing what I wanted. And I added the Wednesday stream because somebody, I think somebody here, was begging for ambient music. And that's like, I can do stuff like that, but I'm not doing it because I like having the rhythmic elements and I'm really interested in that. But what if I just added another day? And as such, I covered many of the ambient things that I could do immediately, and then just started working on the variations. And the more I do of those things, the more I'm familiar with them. And I've developed the facility, like if you're practicing the violin. And then I can think of what I want to hear at any given moment, rather than getting stuck on the mechanics of being able to work the thing at all. The same would hold for album covers. Rather than me not really working in visuals, not really doing that kind of stuff, it becomes 2 times a week by default. I'm gonna open up Clip Studio Paint. I'm gonna load up that the little palette that I made that I mentioned in the tape Redux video. I'm going to have just finished doing a music jam, but I won't be quite done yet because I'm going to grab a screenshot, I'm going to open it up in Clip Studio Paint, and I'm going to take the little stylus and tablet and stuff and do something. It doesn't have to be a good thing, but it's something. I will open it up, and whether it's like I feel like drawing a picture of something, or I feel like making this be totally different, or editing it in some weird way, or writing a cool logo, or using text to do a cool logo, doesn't matter. What matters is I'm going to be firing up that program and doing something 2 times every week for that purpose. So getting down to the Bose question, you're not going to outsource the album cover? Nope. I'm going to be making 2 album covers a week for albums that are on, getting close to an hour and 45 minutes, will no longer fit in a CD, but whatever, doesn't matter. And it's still going to be full resolution on SoundCloud and stuff, although I wonder whether maybe maybe I should start throwing everything on Bandcamp, like Buckethead with his, whatever he called them. Can't think of anything. I do see something from Preston, so let me answer that quickly. You'd like unlinked. I'm not sure whether Buttercomp doesn't already have unlinked. At some other time we can look in the code and look in the code on GitHub, and it may tell you whether it's unlinked or not. Foco likes the new directions and aren't good because I've always done that. I just haven't always talked about it because I know that, like, people want one thing from you. And that's really hard on me because that's not how I work. But people will always be going for, like, they want, another console emulation. Yep. And Preston, committed to programming plugins to controller. Yeah. Like, as in something like a Korg Nano Control or whatever. It's a hardware device that you get to do your mixing with. Channel on 6 and 7, you can't map the console output. I don't know why that would be. Channel 6 and 7, that I'm going to guess that you are on Mac using audio units. And the reason I'm going to guess that is because if you're programming plugins into the controller, and there may be a way to do this, I just wouldn't be the person to ask first off. If you're working on that, then the audio unit version of Channel always has had a pop-up slider. The VST is a fader that is the same as the other two. And so on that one, you could map the console output. But on the audio unit of channel 6 and 7, that's a pop-up menu giving you an integer value. And it may very well be that in Logic or whatever it is that you use, it's not wanting to let you run a pop-up menu using a third-party controller. Oh, you're using VST. In that case, I'm completely baffled. Because on the VST, every single one of those controls is a 0 to 1 number that is drawn as a slider. So I can't help you there because to the VST, they're all the same. And anything using a VST should be able to count on all of those parameters, all of those controls being very much the same thing. Because they are 0 to 1 sliders, and that's all they're ever going to be. But I should also tell you some of the other stuff. Here we are. Last of the chai tea. So yeah, VCV Rack. Yay. I ran VCV Rack. It crashed my audio for a moment because I told it to do the wrong thing. I had one program running at 96K, and I foolishly ran VCV Rack and told its controls to use the 16A, but it was set to 44.1K and everything died. All the audio died. And I had to crash and restart everything and reboot the audio thing. I didn't have to restart the computer, but it killed the program. So that was a drag. Eventually I got it, so it's like, okay, now you think that it's 96K, therefore when you tell the hardware to be using that, you're not breaking everything else on the system. So I got it functioning. I used its little software. I used its little demo and made some sounds happen. So that, given that I'm doing it properly, at least I can do it. I'm not sure whether I can stream it. And then I tried to build the guy that's doing Airwindows plugins. I tried to set up Xcode and be able to build the things that he did in hopes of being able to do them myself, and completely and totally failed. That was another few hours burned on trying to do something that just wouldn't work. So I am not making any VCV Rack plugins yesterday, and I didn't make any VCV Rack plugins today. And if I manage to somehow solve how he got that stuff up and working and building them, then it might become possible for me to build VCV Rack plugins and target that as an output. I'm already having ideas for what I would do if I was able to do it, but I am still not able to do it. I am still not able to build VCV Rack stuff. So there you have it. Like the stuff that I would do, I'd probably be doing a fair bit of logic type things, because I like these, all of this stuff that I've got in my synthesizer, that I'm constantly like unplugging everything and then plugging it up from scratch next time I do a piece of music. Like two-thirds of that is control. Two-thirds of that is sequencing and control. And the interesting thing about that is that it could be very CPU friendly. And that's a good thing for VCV Rack, because VCV Rack is very CPU demanding. What you basically would do for control-oriented things is be watching for control voltages that are like going between 0 and 1 or whatever, control voltages that are, triggers and gates and things. And if it's done correctly, which I think it is, VCV Rack can't tell whether something is a continuous voltage or a control voltage. And in reality, your control voltages are often somewhat fuzzy or weird. But, oh, hey, Nojo. You are the Airwindows person. Cool. I was not able to build your stuff, but I love that you're doing it. Maybe at some point I'll figure out a way to actually download your stuff, and then I can use it. So far I can't use it or build it, but that's the thing is, if you were doing, and hey, we got 18 folks here, cool. Be asking questions and stuff. That way we can keep chattering away until 12:42, because we're doing an hour and 42 minutes today. That's how well the Patreon's doing, so it's tied to how much time I spend. So the thing with these control voltages is that you could get a very, very efficient VCV Rack thing going on by basically taking, caching your outputs and stuff. And then what you're doing is you're paying attention to the previous input, and you've got a little check before you do anything, which is like, oh, okay, we have this complicated way of, like you're doing just friends, so you're triggering this waveform. Actually, that's a bad example because that's continuous stuff. You're doing like a Turing machine style thing, which you can already get in VCV Rack. So you're triggering these various gates and there's randomness. And so do you run a random calculation literally every cycle? That's going to start chewing up VCV Rack really bad. It's expensive. Even if you're doing the Airwindows style dither type stuff, which gives you a pseudo-random thing. But if you're catching the input to the thing, which you're expecting to be a gate, and you're watching that input the first thing you do is go, oh, hi, is the input right now exactly the same as the previous input? Because this is a deterministic machine, and so therefore we're waiting for something new to happen. And if the input is different than what it was before, then we do our calculation. Otherwise, produce the previous output. Done. So you want your plugins that don't have to be continuous to be essentially a single if statement and saved variable, unless they absolutely have to think of what to do next. So the whole thing is there's a lot of control circuitry, and like I said, like I've got the real rack, I love it to death, but big piles of that don't have to do anything until a gate comes in or until the trigger comes in. And you can save so much CPU power by not doing an elaborate calculation for what you're, like, you can do some kind of funky control system where it's like, if this gate goes on, then check to see whether these other gates go on and calculate the combination of these things together and stuff, and then give it to this output. And the output is the elaborate logic of all these things. Well, that's fine, but do you need to do that calculation 96,000 times a second? Or are you waiting for a trigger to come in which case you wait for the trigger to come in, something changes, like from 0, you're expecting it all to be 0, and as soon as something changes, then you do that new calculation and you do it once, and then wait for something to change again. Like you're watching for, is everything exactly the same as it previously was? And if you have a deterministic thing, then you can wait for something to change and only calculate when basically stuff is sort of flagged as dirty, where you know you're going to need to calculate it again. And that would make VCV Rack super more workable compared to some of the more naive ways of doing things. And that's what I'd like to dig into. That and I can tell you what I would do with console, because the thing about Rack is you're not necessarily going to run a console system in quite the same way. In VCV Rack, what you're going to have is internal mixer units. Those are what you're going to use console on. So basically, you'll be making a mixer, and I've started to fool around with stuff. I've looked at your code. I downloaded that stuff and downloaded the most recent one. I can't set up the development environment, but I can see what's in there, and it looks like someday I'll be able to do it. And I can also see things like there is the, aren't they PNG files? There's a combination of files, like there's PNG files and there's bitmap files, and I honestly don't understand what the requirements are of all those different things. But I'm pretty sure I can get Inkscape or whatever, and to some extent, I can make PNG files that are reminiscent of like my old mastering tool stuff. Only to some extent though, because that drew the controls with basically draw commands, but there's highlights and shading on stuff. And if I just draw a single image, even if it's a SVG and it has highlights and shading and stuff, but then you turn it, the highlights and stuff will turn with it, and so that'll kind of ruin the effect. But that's not to say like I could have that and then have some shading on the background image, and that would work. Or like different kinds of transparencies or whatever. There's definitely ways that it could be done. Like it could be a like here's one way that you could fake 3D shading on something that wasn't really 3D, assuming certain things about that you're clicking on the control and it doesn't actually require you to click on opaque areas of the image that you're drawing the knob with. If you're drawing the knob with an SVG and rotating it, what you could do is draw the image just on the background, like rendered out nicely so that it has a little bit of shading and it has a little bit of highlighting. And then the detent that moves is a image that's drawn on a mostly transparent SVG. So that basically shows the knob underneath, but you're not really drawing the knob, you're drawing the thing on it that makes it look as if it's moving to different settings. And you can do whatever you want it there. You could make like little bits of dirt or whatever, and those would rotate. The only limitation would be that those would always be, like, you wouldn't be able to highlight them in a special way. Any things that you drew on the surface of the knob to make it look as if it was a moving thing would have to be just an image of some kind. Maybe you could, I mean, in SVG, you might even be able to do things like transparency, so there might be cool things to do there. But what you'd be doing, basically you're doing like game rendering tricks or like visual rendering tricks. You're getting into that world of imagery. Like, for instance, if I was going to be doing this and I wanted to make a watercolor knob, because I was talking about my watercolor thing on the tape redux issue. If I was to do that, what I do is like maybe take a brush or something like that. I'd maybe draw a circle and then take the watercolor thing and make whatever kinds of marks that I want to overlay. And then maybe paint another one that was supposed to be fixed on the back, on the background. And then the one that I'm overlaying is going to be mostly transparent, but it is going to include whatever it is that rotates around and shows you where the knob is pointing. And so basically you're making a knob out of overlay modes by using transparency, which I don't know works in rack. But if it's rendering SVGs as part of its thing, it's possible that it does work in rack. It just requires experiment. We got to find out about this because the rewards would be great. But see, these are visual graphics artists' tricks or game designer tricks, that kind of stuff, which the designers of something like rack aren't necessarily experienced enough artists to know that you can do these things, nor do they necessarily have the ideas to think of the stuff to do with them if you did. But oh, Ricardo has a quick answer for Ricardo. People are chattering away at the same thing that I'm chattering away about, but then we suddenly have a question. Console in Ardor. If you put console in mono tracks, you use only one of the two inputs. I think you could probably, I think it's designed so that they're running in parallel because it's a VST. So you can use either both of the inputs together, or you can use one of the inputs in the same output and not do anything with the other. It depends. Like, I'm not sure how everything handles VSTs when they go to mono, but do what works, basically. I'm not familiar with Ardor. Figure out how, what Ardor expects you to do and then use that. But yeah, the building plugins for rack, that's the thing, is that there is some sophistication that you could get into as far as those visual representations. I would be wanting to do that. I would be coming up with something interesting. And again, you don't necessarily have to draw every aspect of the knob in the graphic that is going to be rotating and showing where it's pointing. If you cool, yeah. Well, if you use both and the volume is clearly wrong, then using one is the right way. Hey, Pix showed up. So that's my whole wrap as far as that is concerned. Is at the roughly halfway mark, a little past halfway mark. is you don't have to render all of the parts of the knob in the same place. It's on a computer. If you register it correctly, you can draw things as part of the knob on the background and draw things that are part of the rotating stuff on the graphic, and then have that be semi-transparent. And that would be a fantastic way to do one of the things that I've been wanting to do, namely emulate the Airwindows mastering tools knobs in any such thing. I'd be going for something like that because I thought those looked nice, and I thought it was a fairly attractive way of making the knobs go. But in order to do that, I'd have to draw it and then have only the little dot rotate. And I wouldn't be able to do that as a proper indent either, because that, again, is drawing based on where it's rotated. So it's doing a 3D rendering at any given moment. So it would be necessary to replace the little detent with maybe a dot or something that was not rendered 3D. It could be a simple ring, as long as it didn't have a dent in it that caught the light in any particular way, or it could be a solid block, or it could be a pointer, like an arrow. And that would work as well. It just cannot be something that catches the light in a 3D sense. But by the same token, if you want to really sell the idea that the knob is actually rotating, what you do is you draw the background colors and the lighting and shading of the knob on your background image. Then you have the rotating part of the knob that's normally like you think that you have to just draw the whole knob. Not necessarily. The rotating part of the knob gets the pointer and any surface dirt or defects that would be rotating with the knob. And the underlying part would be lighting and shading, but done in this very clean, pure way where it's going to be a perfect example of lighting. I don't have anything to draw with here. You're just going to have to live with my talking. It's hard for me to explain this. I'm trying to explain it in words, and it's an image thing. But suffice it to say, and I'd love the chance to experiment with this. I'm really excited about eventually getting there. Suffice it to say, it'll be possible to do some really interesting experiments with these knobs and graphics in VCV Rack, or indeed anything that renders this kind of stuff. And that's what you get when you have somebody that's sort of digging into the graphic design stuff. The funny thing is, I'm not all that great at that stuff. I did a webcomic for some years and removed it from the internet, which is just as well because it didn't have a decent story and didn't really go anywhere. I learned on it. But I've always been fairly interested in these art skills things, and I've moved more in the direction of being able to work with that. And that's what comes to the forefront when I see things like VCV Rack, and they're going like, okay, here, this is your interface, and this is our funny sort of knurled abstract shape that's clearly programmer art that came out of Inkscape and stuff. And that is, you know, I see that stuff and I'm like, I could take that a little bit farther. Somebody doesn't seem to really quite understand, you know, they're not even making the knobs have any detail or anything, because it's like drawing the knob itself was clearly tough enough to do. But that's because a lot of people who are, you know, a lot of people who program aren't really working with music and mixing and gear to the extent of people that have been doing music for years. And if they've been doing those things, they're not necessarily doing visual arts for years. And because it's hard and it takes a really long time to dive into all of those things. And I can tell you personally, if you choose to dive into all of those things and develop experience with all of it, it takes you decades upon decades to get half good at any of it, which kind of sucks. That's not fair. Like, if you're young and expect to not just be groveling around in some crappy apartment starving for literally all your life, then maybe you want to focus on a particular thing and also include some marketing and advertising in the stuff that you do. But if you do, or if you did, because it's too late for me now, I've already done this. It cost me a lot too. But if you do try to be so interdisciplinary that you have all of the things, that you've done all of the things, you wind up able to look at something like VCV and go like, oh, hey, look, here's how they've rendered this. Here's how they've made these controls out of these images. If this image was semi-transparent, you'd be able to model or mimic this effect using this overlaid on top of that and rotating there, whereas these background things are blah and blah, 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 and thus and so. And it's not difficult or complicated for you because you're already experienced with, like, this is what light does as it bounces off the thing. If I wanted to make the knob look like it was made of fur, this is what I would need to do with the Fresnel of the outside edge, or so on or so forth. Velvet knob plugins. But, there's the challenge. And this is one of the reasons why I do open source and try to put out the equipment that I do, is that you gotta give people stuff that's not in the domain that they have expertise on, so that they can get it and start fooling around and playing and trying to do stuff with it. So yeah, let me scan over things. I'm not a programmer apparently because I didn't find developing for Rack. Actually, the thing about it is, looking at the parts that you had, it seemed, I wouldn't argue with that. Bits of that does seem dead easy. Managing the development environment is the part that I find difficult, and that's what's stopping me so far. So I'm not that kind of programmer. I'm too damn interdisciplinary. I am too full of ideas on the visual representations of knobs and not on the how do I get this freaking thing compiling. So, yeah. People talking a little bit on gear something. And Nojo, yeah, be sure and put the Airwindows stuff up in some downloadable place, if for no other reason than so I can get them too, because right now it looks to me as if I can get the code, but I'm not clear on how I can download the actual plugins and fool with them. And I'd like to do that. I can listen to them and tell you whether they're working right or not. So yeah, that takes us to noon. Hey. We are busily proceeding through the question and answer thing. I've certainly had plenty to chatter about. Honestly, it's weird sometimes when it's like, I know I'm supposed to mostly be doing plugins. I am mostly doing plugins. One of the things I'm gearing up for is to re-release some of those old amp simulators, not because I think they're good, but because people are wanting them. I've talked about that repeatedly. I will be getting into it. But I also get derailed a lot into things like, how do I get myself to start regularly building album covers in like Clip Studio Paint or whatever? I would say Clip Studio Paint because I tried like Krita, even though it is free, I didn't like it as much. And Affinity Studio is not as good of a paint program. It's pretty good at retouching though. And yeah, and I dive into stuff like that and spend days learning how to use Blender or things like that. Because there's always more to do. And my challenge is being able to share that in such a way where people can get something out of the many hours that I spend trying to do these other things, but also so that I'm able to communicate it in some way, even though it's this huge scattered universe of things that I've dug into. Because that's the thing, when you're interested in everything and trying to do everything, it takes you many, many decades. And if I'm lucky, I will have pursued some of the things that I really am fascinated by before I die. You know, I'll have made my little animated movie or something like that. You know, I've already written books. That's a whole other story, believe me. But, you know, when the range of your interests is too big, that becomes a thing. So Computer Musician is asking maybe one of those dynamic convolution type plugins that uses, well, people have already done that. There's no reason for me to do that because people have already done it. And it's not a type of thing that I am that interested in, honestly. It's a whole other style of stuff. Oh, Ahmed, I would never partner up with Stephen Slate. I don't think we see things the same way. But I do understand why he has a great deal of success with things, is because one of the things I've learned over the years is you can't get around, you know, like just capitalism or something. Like I was watching, there's somebody that I was following on Twitter who's one of the comedians in the Loading Ready Run team, and I was saddened by how stuff worked out there because the guy had showed up to a meeting, and I was following him and his not safe for work alt, and he showed up for a meeting, and somebody else who doesn't get along with him very well basically sassed him about being late, even though he was only a minute late, and he was really upset. Probably didn't show it that much at the time, hard to say, but mouthed off on Twitter a little bit. And in the regular Twitter that other people, his coworkers in this internet thing, in the regular Twitter, he was like, don't, you know, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. But in the alt, he was like, oh, I felt really disrespected. And just so as you know, people, those bits that you give us for the tips, we don't see any of that. Which sounds terrible. There's a thing, though. It's like the company that does Loading Ready Run decided it was too difficult to divvy up like tiny little contributions like bits, which are apparently on Twitch, you can give people like a penny. And the when the guy said, oh, by the way, we don't get any of those tips, no, what the business manager, and I think I know who the guy is, and he is just burning bridges with these folks, and he's one of my favorite comedians out of the group. So I'm seeing this team struggling because somebody's getting grumpy and some of the decisions that they've made are not necessarily friendly decisions. And if you think like, well, I'm the funny guy here, and so therefore when people give tips, I should get some of that, they decided to send the tips only to the sort of overall company. So nobody gets any of those. They all get basically salary or working on a contract rate, and it's not good pay. But, you know, none of this shit that we do is good pay. I mean, none of this... I'm getting fairly good, and I've been beating myself into the ground for decades upon decades to get there. None of the stuff that we do as entertainers or comedians or musicians or, you know, like popular plugin guys or whatever, that is not the way to make bank. You make bank by becoming a banker or by finding good ways to harm other people and take their money and, become a pirate, basically. Only the legal pirate that is doing it with other people's labor or whatever. So it saddened me that this team of folks that I liked and valued and respected, and there are many great things about them, but they're getting some static because they're up against these things like, no, you can't take these tips and divvy them up among the people. Nobody is going to agree on, like, if it's all literally even, then that's like, the word was equitable. It's like, okay, if you divvy all the tips up and they're literally even, then some of the people who are never on screen are going to get them. If you don't divvy them up even, then somebody's going to lose their damn mind because somebody else is getting paid more. And it's just a losing game. So on that side, it's like, hi, I'm not on Team U. I am siding with your business manager, even though I don't like him as much, because it's a built-in fail of a question, what to do with stuff like that. And no matter what they do, you're all not going to be paid very well. In some ways, I'm not paid very well. I mean, I get to do cool stuff. I get to have some amazing things, but people normally have like your 401ks and things, and they like build a life for themselves. I don't get to do that. I get to be Chris from Airwindows, and that's an amazing thing. But there are big limits on what you can expect out of that. So yeah, let me have a look at the chat again, rather than just chattering again. That's what I meant about the marketing, when marketing came up, is as the challenge. So yeah, Arif Al-Hok says, tape is still creating aliasing even on 192K. Really? In such a way that it's making noises that bother you? Don't feed in frequencies that are above 96K. If you're, I don't know what to tell you. It shouldn't sound like it's making lots of aliasing. And no, you can't get rid of it. There is no way to change that. I think you're probably testing it, although I could be wrong. If you're hearing aliasing out of the new tape plugin on normal music material, then you should not be using it. And it seems kind of weird to me, because even if you're running at 192K on normal music material, you shouldn't be hearing anything like aliasing. You've got to be just measuring for it. And that's not necessarily your friend. Measuring for stuff like that is just going to make you miserable. So if you need to get rid of the aliasing, don't use it. So Slate, with the tendency, yeah. That makes money. Lying to people makes money. You say, oh, this is why the thing is, because this is the thing that you need. I can, for many, many years, like just this morning, right? Just this morning, I had somebody, for all I know, they're on the chat. Probably not, though. I got this message, and it's like, PayPal says you've got money. I'm like, oh, cool. Within certain limitations, I like money. I like money in certain cases. And so let's see what this money is that PayPal says that I got. And it was a guy, and he was like, $40. Here, give me density. Like, really? Seriously? A previous person had been like, oh, thank you so much. I love what you're doing. Here, have $10 for your trouble. And I was like, cool, absolutely. And this guy's like, give me density, please, $40. But they clearly went on to my website and went to some kind of place or whatever, formed this idea like, oh, this is how you get that? Okay, cool. I've heard this was a good thing. And so what I did was I went on to PayPal and I immediately refunded their $40. So no, take this back. And in the note that I alonged with it, I was like, yeah, you shouldn't pay for that. Don't you understand? It's free and open source. Here's a link. And I linked to the density plug that came out of VST for them to get. And I assume that is sending all of their money back. At least I hope so. I hope that PayPal didn't like keep part of it. But that was my reaction to that, and that is another sort of marketing style thing. Because I'm not the type of person to be like, oh, cool, person sent me $40. First, I'm keeping that. Second of all, what do I need to do to have them not be mad at me? That is not how I think. So I've been acting like that for literally some decades now. And for longer than some of you have been alive. And I can tell you that taking that approach ruins your financial success and has gotten in the way. As you can see from some of the stuff that I have in my world, it doesn't completely and totally get in the way, and I'm very grateful for that. But not being like lying marketing guy gets in the way. Not being like lying marketing guy will hurt you. If you refuse to do marketing, if you refuse to do advertising, and I've always refused to do advertising because I just don't like it. I don't like being told what to do. And that's just my personal thing. It's like I don't like getting told what to think. But my refusal to do that has hurt me over the years. And that has a lot to do with why I don't get any further than I have. So I gotta be grateful for what I've got, which is fairly easy to do at this stage. I've been at this for enough decades that there's a lot of very heartwarming, nice, delightful things going on. But it'll hurt you not doing any of that kind of stuff. So be careful what you wish for. Be careful with what makes you super mad, because there's a gray area in there. And there's several, there's a green area down at the bottom, which is Bo asking some questions. A couple of people asking questions. So right now in the pipeline, I got a couple of more character plugins. I'll be putting out Precious in Elation. Elation is kind of compressy, but not really, and it's just more of a color producer, and it's one of those really old ones, so it's coming out exactly as it existed. And I'm making no claims about this is my current picture of how I would do an LE2A. No. It's just a reissue of a really older thing that didn't exist before in VST form. What's also in the pipeline is I do intend to, I actually have a list of stuff, but I can't get it right now. I do intend to dig into some of those old amp things, and I've got about 6 of them. And so I think it's Ahmed who's asking for that, and that is coming. That's in the pipeline. I know I'll be able to grind through and do those, and so that's on the list. I also have an idea for one that is nobody's asking for, but I'm real interested in it anyway. I am going to do a sort of multi-band EQ-y kind of thing, but what it'll do is basically distribute the attacks of stuff so that it does things similar to what my modular drum stuff does, where I have kick drums and low frequencies hitting a little bit earlier. It's almost like linear phase filtering in a way, because with linear phase filtering, what you've got is the sort of convolution shape of what the filter does, starting to do things before the moment of truth comes, and then fading off afterwards, and they're more or less equally balanced. And it's not a natural phenomenon, but it's a measurement phenomenon. It's a way of measuring things real accurately in certain domains. I don't think the ear likes this way of calculating stuff. But, so if you were doing a very sharp high-frequency filter, the wiggling of the convolution of the high-frequency filter would start before the impulse and then go after the impulse. Well, the way that I do beats, the way that I do grooves, is to make sure that the low-frequency stuff is hitting first. So like the rise time of the attack transient needs to swoop up in the lows before hitting its peak, at which more or less the high frequency stuff hits as well. And then on the aftermath of it, that's when things like snare drums and stuff hit. I'm going to be going through the synthesizer and like redoing the Erica synths, redoing the triggering thing. I got drum sequencer there. I'm mostly using it entirely for just different pulses, different pulse times, different pulse rates. You know, you got your 16th notes, but then I've also got like your quarter note kick drum thing going on, and I can have a special pulse for that. And I can have the pulse offset in time so the kick drum hits a little bit earlier. And I can have it offset later so that things like a snare drum hit later. And I can run them into some of the other control so that they're like randomizing the attacks and just increment these various things in such a way that, like my kick drum sequencer, it might be randomizing the attacks of the kicks, but at the same time, all of them are going to be slightly time offset. And then there'll be another one running which is randomizing the snares, and that also is being fed by a similar pulse. But the snares will always be like swung. They'll always be a little bit later. They'll be doing that Ringo Starr thing where there's a flow to it. So the new EQ idea is essentially, and I'm going to be calling it Mauve because of Deadmau5 and MAU 5. V is 5 in Roman numerals, so I'll call it Mauve. The Airwindows Discord should be still around. Let me quickly glance at that. I'll like literally fire it up right now. Oh god, it's downloading updates. That's great. It may or may not be able to start, or maybe I'll just crash everything while trying. But, and it's saying that it's doing streamer mode. Airwindows, last thing I put there was in March 16th, but it appears to still be existing. I got 4 patrons and 15 people online, and that's all I need to see about that. Yeah, it's not anything anybody uses, but it does exist. I'm not sure why anybody would say that it didn't exist. It really does. So one other thing that's in the pipeline is this Mauve plugin idea, where it'll be like, imagine a multi-band distortion or a multi-band compressor, but I'm much less interested in compressing the bands. And what I'm interested in is delaying the high frequency stuff so that everything will form itself into this spread out thing where the lows hit a little bit first and then the highs are a little delayed. And the idea is that it could be used on things like kicks and stuff, or it could be used just as a reshaping tool. It would mangle phase response gloriously. It'll be like a phase shifter, like flanger kind of sound to it. It'll be really weird. But even though it would be really weird, it might mangle sounds in a super interesting way. And it might be very useful for like electronic kicks and snares and things. Certainly kicks, like snares, you might want the opposite to happen. You might want the highs to hit first. But so I could make it go in reverse, I suppose. But the idea, oh, it would be comb filtering like crap, yeah. It'll mangle the sound super bad. But it will also, when done extensively enough, and it'll be comb filtering to the extent that the filters aren't sharp enough. So I might end up using a bunch of biquads and just make it really steep. But or I'll figure something out. I'll do something with it that'll work. But it'll do a bunch of complicated, messed up comb filtering. And if I make the filter super sharp, it won't do the comb filtering, but it will mangle phase relationships in the attacks incredibly hard. So that'd be the weird plug for you, Ahmed. That'd be a thing. And that is also in the pipeline at some point. I'm not sure how quick it's going to be to develop. That's one of the challenges that I run in with like telling you folks about what I'm going to be doing, is that I might be telling you something that will only show up in 2021. Probably not. Probably it'll be sooner, but you know, them's the risks you run. I'm just looking at my keyboard here and seeing that I've already worn the letters off of so many of these. It's a good keyboard too, but I just type too much. So let me keep a look at some of these comments and things. Oh, I might also mention melody lines at the top of that chat. And that's one of the reasons I've been fooling around with Godot engine, and I downloaded the Unreal Engine and then decided that I didn't want it, and also that it was misbehaving really badly by running this Epic launcher and like launching it whenever I ran the computer. So I was like, okay, you go away now. And I got back into Unity, which I used to use, and I've downloaded the most recent version of that, and I got to see whether I can use some kind of code editor that actually functions, because apparently it expects you to use the Visual Studio for Mac, which crashes all the time, and I don't understand what people actually do when the story is, oh, you're supposed to use this thing, and then the word on the street is, it doesn't ever work. So, or it just doesn't reliably work. So I'm already experimenting with some alternates for that. I miss old monodevelop, but there were problems there too. And one of the things I want to dig into, which is why I jumped on Unity for this, is I want to make a melody engine that does my chord organ type stuff, of figuring out what chords go with what, and what chords are in what. But I want to, rather than start with that, I want to start with being able to spell out a melody just as notes, like a piano roll kind of thing. And then maybe also write a bass line or additional harmony melodies and just sort of write that stuff down. Like, okay, if I was to sing like Row, Row, Row Your Boat, and that's the beginning of the melody, but then it goes up another whole step, making a kind of whole tone, and goes to some funny notes, what chords would you use for when you went to the funny whole tone note? And can you pick a chord that is cool enough or related enough to the previous ones that it would make the unusual note that you chose sound right and be memorable? And I'd like to explore that. That's going to take some work too. That's also in the pipeline as far as I'm actively pursuing it in various ways. I'm not sure whether I need to draw it out on paper first or something like that, do some kind of strange variation of how to try it out and see whether it even works. But yeah, that is on the, you've seen my old chord organ wheel of circle of fifths chord chart thing. I've shown that off before. I'm looking at it now. I have red circles for all the guitar chords that are comfortable to play. And I'm wanting to find, especially since I did that one rock music jam that ended up using the mimetic digitalis sequencer just to generate series of 4 chords using the chord organs, and that actually worked out quite well. That was good. That was the thing that did work. But it left me feeling like I'm just randomly generating these things until I get ones that I like. And wouldn't it be neat to dive into some of this chord stuff with my new knowledge of, like, if I'm playing this F chord, then a C7th chord also makes sense within this structure. Where would I use the C7th chord? Or a G7th chord is like right next door to it. And, a C chord is right next door to it. What is located within the same general chord area? And where could you take some of these, like, if you were doing the Row, Row, Row Your Boat thing, and then went up an additional note in a whole tone kind of way, to what extent is that just really weird and insane, and to what extent does that fit into what's being done? Like, this cycle of chords here, if I added that whole tone, if I added that unusual note, where does that take our chord chart? And I've never actually found the answer to that question because I haven't been pursuing it. I haven't been looking it up. It's probably not that hard to do. Like with all of these basic chord things, like an area where I could do G minor or D minor or F or A minor with a funny second or stuff like that, the seventh chords. Well, the root note is still available in the thing, so those are available, and I can always look up the root note in one of the what I should probably do is figure out these areas where it's like, what note makes a seventh chord be the seventh chord? If I have a C seventh chord, and this is a really easy question, it's just that I don't know the answer. If I have a C seventh chord, and that's one of the chords that's within this zone, does that mean that seventh note is one of the root notes of the other chords that I have available? Does that make the seventh note like a G or an F or an E or something like that? In a different area, if I'm looking at like B flat or an A flat, does that mean that the F sharp is also in one of these chord notes? If so, that makes things a little simpler. That's something I'm going to have to look up. Figure that out, because that would be handy to have that like bing inspiration moment and understand how that worked. Oh, goodness gracious, yes. Music and soundscapes, tape, Swellotron. I don't know what Swellotron is. Ben, by all means, keep throwing ideas. I don't respond to all of your ideas, and I won't respond to all of your ideas. But Ben has been popping up on a lot of YouTube videos and stuff, making critical comments. Every now and then those come in handy. So feel free to carry it up. Don't expect that I'm always going to jump in, I'm not going to jump and do all of the things that you say, and I'm not necessarily going to register all of the observations, but they're always interesting. And, engaging people is always useful in its own right. Ahmed is asking, can we have a Rocky Jam day? I can't really... No, I know you don't mean the boxer. If you mean like what I did with that one track called Confined, that was a heavy day. That was a tough day. No, hey, interesting. Bo has just answered the question in a useful way. Thank you. So I am not in a place where I'm ready to do the tracking with instrument for no other reason. I will break my hands and put blisters on my fingers playing the drums if I have to do that. I do intend to go into that zone, but at this time I can't be doing that on a regular basis. And I'm also just trying to, like, this entire chat, you've heard me barely able to keep my head together. I'm like not making sense because there's too many things going on in my head, and I just have to live with that sometimes. People do complain, but I just have to live with that sometimes. If I was to add doing rock tracks on a regular day, I think I would be fried in 2 weeks. I wouldn't be able to keep it up. Maybe it'll go in that direction at some time in the future. And the problem with rock riffs, I've done that before and I had to stop, and I'll tell you why. I have guitars and I know how to run them through the amp and distort them and stuff like that. And for a long time I was doing like music where it's like, okay, here's this, it's repeating, it's playing a chord or a note or something like that, and I've got this cycling, and now I'm going to blow over it, I'm going to shred guitar, and it wound up being really boring because it's like the Frank Zappa thing. I'll defer to Zappa for this, which is Zappa thought of things in terms of being like a Calder sculpture. You'd have dense stuff, you'd have sparse stuff, and they would balance themselves out in such a way that you wound up with art. And he was very good at doing that. and juxtaposing things. Now, the trouble with heavy guitar stuff, if you're not a metal band, or if you're not in a context where that's just all you do, especially if you were in that zone where you are doing like electronic style music, is you can go into this area where it's really boring and repetitive because, you know, you've got the guitar shredding away, but that's all it's doing and nothing else is changing and nothing is happening. So I've been learning bit by bit, and it's been a very slow process, learning to not play, learning to, you know, put the heavy, grindy, crazy sound in there, which I do many of. I like Aphex Twin for that stuff too. I put the heavy, grindy Aphex Twin madness in briefly, and then it stops. And so doing a rock day is like saying I need to do the thing and then go for an hour and 42 minutes doing that thing. Even I get bored when I do that. Never mind, you know, no listener is going to put up with it. Probably not even you. I think practically I have to change stuff up more, so I need to learn how to do that. Oh, Cosmic has a question about some of this stuff. This is where I get exciting about is, how hard is it to make the Turing? It's Turing, machine make breaks, fills, and build-ups. Breaks it's not going to do by nature. It evolves by nature. Fills it doesn't do by nature, but you could make it trigger a fill in the right way with a specific thing, because you have those in VCV Rack too, so it's worth talking about this. And build-ups, it's made out of build-ups. What the Turing machine does is it's a shift register, meaning it does random voltages in a whole series of like gates and triggers and things. So if you hold down the right button to 0, it just rides on 0 for a while until occasionally it'll flip a bit. Then you have 1 bit cycling through, and then it'll flip another bit, then it'll have 2 bits cycling through. If these are your triggers triggering a drum hit, what happens is you've got your cycle rate, and then it'll bring boop, boop, a drum hit, and then another one, boop, 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 and it'll go to about 50% density. If you give it full randomness, it'll just build up to that stage. And so build-ups, it's really well suited to, and it's also pretty well suited to making abrupt changes like that. Like if you have it going on and you want everything to sparse out, you'll hold down the right control, go like, okay, silence, all your new inputs are nothing now. And then it does that. So break, and you've also got another thing which I think is in VCV Rack, where it's got some logic where it's watching things like 1, 2, or 1 and 2. And if both 1 and 2 have bits positive, that means the 1 and 2 will go on. And there's one that's like 1, 3, 5, and 7 or whatever. There's a set of ones that are partly logic oriented where it's not just watching that one as it cycles through, it's watching for combinations of them, and they both have to be true for the result to be true. And those are more sparse. Those are where you'd put in things like fills. Like you'd hit a fill only when it hits the 1 and 2 and 3 and 7, or whatever the thing is. Your problem is then you have a cycle. If you hit that once, it's going to continue to hit it every single time. So unless you program it so that once you hit that, you're also plugging in zeros and making it go sparse again. But it's more about building. It's not about breaks. It's not about fills, because it repeats. It evolves, but it repeats. So yeah. And plugins for iOS is possible, but I can't be into that. It requires compilers that are too current, and I don't use those. I'm excited about hearing that the 7th, like a C7th is what B flat, because that fits in with the chord concept that I'm doing. That means that the minor note is likely to also be another one of those small set of notes. And there's a lot of useful things I can do with that. Yeah, and people are talking about the music theory. I'm very interested in music theory. I may not be very expert about it, but it is a heck of a cool topic. And Ahmed, you're talking Zappa again. The 12-note scale, and of course the intonation. You know, that's one of the neatest things that that bass player dude is into, Adam Neely. Adam Neely, who makes more money than me on Patreon most likely, and has a much bigger YouTube channel. And I think he well deserves it because he is such a jazz nerd and beyond jazz nerd that not only is he into like this incredibly atonal 12-note kind of stuff, he has come up with stuff that blows my mind. There's a fairly recent one where he was doing all of the different flavors of jazz, like the Scoville units of jazz harmony. And it's well worth, go and find that once I'm finished making this. Go and check that out if you haven't seen it before, because what it does is, it's like, okay, we got some 7th. Okay, we've got 9ths and 11ths and 13ths and stuff. And his increasing levels of jazz harmony start out like very normal, and then they get weirder and weirder, and then they get incredibly atonal, and it's like, oh god, that's too much jazz, man. That's just gross. What are you doing? All you're doing is like smashing your head on the piano keyboard is basically what it's like. And it's like, okay, I never need to hear that again. And then he's got several levels beyond that, and it's like, how do you go beyond that? Well, I'll tell you how he goes beyond that. And xenoharmonic is one of the words that he uses. What he's doing when he's going beyond just the super dissonant jazzy stuff, he's getting into intonation. And what he's doing is, and he mentions Jacob Collier in this. It was really, I don't think I can apply it, but it's very interesting to hear about this stuff. Again, Jacob Collier, absolutely. And then also Adam Neely talking about the theory of it all. Because what he's doing is he is taking chords and going with like the melody, and then he's taking chords and retuning the entire chord so that certain harmonic elements are in just intonation with the melody, meaning that the entire pitch base of his chord alters from chord to chord. The whole thing is, and it sounds astonishing and kind of vaporwavy and weird. It's the coolest thing. It's the coolest thing ever. Although it's practically, and then he finishes it up by playing his outro as the same concept applied to one of those like lo-fi hip-hop vaporwave things. Oh, it was so funny and so awesome. So yeah, go and look up this particular video by Adam Neely. It's Levels of Jazz Harmony. It's also, you might be able to find it looking for Scoville levels of jazz harmony, because Scoville is the metric of spices. And it's like what kinds of peppers are spicier or not. And when he gets really, really clashing, normal equal temperament, but just really clashy, is like, that's spicy. And mostly it's just ugly. But ugly, Zappa fans know ugly is cool. And then when he goes beyond, and the Zen harmonic stuff, he is literally changing intonation for the chords so that certain elements of the chords harmonize with the melody notes that he's got. And the basic tuning, like I can do a C that is 5 cents sharp, or I can do a F that is 12 cents flat to make this note fit with the note that's in the melody. And it's like, oh my God. And when he's finished doing it, it's like, whoa, that sounds so different. That sounds so different. So absolutely, absolutely. And that brings us to 12:40. So we're a few minutes from being done. Running extra minutes because the Patreon is going so well. As always, if you need to take care of yourself, you totally can jump off the Patreon. It would cut down my time very slightly, and I'd be out of here slightly sooner, and I'd still be doing fine. But hey, if people want me talking about Adam Neely or things like that with you all and doing my music jams for a few extra minutes, that is a side benefit of how well the Patreon is doing. And I will be finding things to do, talking about stuff in the pipeline. Like, I'm really excited, although I haven't done much with it right now. I'm really excited with the prospects of like ordering some more perf board for putting electronic components on, ordering some more random, like LEDs and things. You can go to All Electronics and get like packages of 1,000 LEDs for insanely cheap. And doing that secret briefcase solder core stuff I've been talking about. Because the whole thing there is you can get chips for 30 cents each. I promise that if we get to like $2,000 on the Patreon, I'm going to start putting every bit of money beyond that into like processing and selling onwards collections of chips and things at cost. Meaning I wouldn't actually be losing money, but it wouldn't be a profit center. It would be like, this is something that I do that is a non-profit activity that puts large numbers of these electronic parts that you can still get and do stuff with into people's hands so that they can fool with it. The problem you run into is if you're trying to do something like that and you're doing it in like Eurorack, jacks cost like $1. Potentiometers cost like $1. Switches are insane. Switches are dollars and dollars to buy. So if you're doing a couple hundred of those for some elaborate thing, man, it's already going to cost you stupid amounts of money. But if you have just these extremely cheap chips, and you can make stuff just out of all that in a bag of chips, what if you had sockets that you could plug like Bastel style teeny patches into? It'd be hard to do, but if you got that going, you could put together something really sophisticated that did a complicated sound that would be perfectly fine. It would sound about as good as a booklet thing, because rather than being these flimsy wires and coax with the whole 9 yards and stuff, you're basically having a teeny jumper cable that could probably carry a couple of amps. But it would just be miniaturized, but it wouldn't be miniaturized sound. And I'm very excited about getting that going, and because I figured out the final thing, apart from like power supply, which I do need to figure out, but ways to build that into your briefcase or build that into something like that, where instead of having to get Eurorack rails, which are also expensive, you build it out of pine boards. And all you got to do is enough woodwork to be able to make the pine boards, put it into whatever enclosure it is that you've got, whether that be a box or a lunchbox or a briefcase from the Goodwill or something like that. Anything that you get, a trumpet case, rock on. And you just make it exactly the size of Eurorack, so that they're cross-compatible. And then for your secret briefcase build, what you do is you get thumbtacks, and you can put the pin of a thumbtack through the holes in the perf board and stick them into the wood that is making up your like rack rails. And then you can build a pile of these things and have them be removable again if you really needed to, for dirt cheap. And that is what interests me about that project, is being able to cobble stuff together in such a way that other people could also cobble stuff together, and then we could all start doing crazy electronic soldery things and building synthesizers, because there's so many cool things you can get. Not only can you get all those CMOS chips, but you can also get synthesizer chips, like 1 volt per octave oscillator. All you got to do is get the chip and then wire up around it enough that it's working, but you could set it up with this sort of jumper cable stuff and it would actually work, and you'd have a good oscillator that tracked pitch well that you could run your like logic CMOS circuits sequencers and things into. There's many possibilities. But that said, there may be many possibilities, but I need to cool it for today because this is actually a busy day for me. I've got other stuff happening literally at 1. So I don't get to actually stay for additional hours. Grant, if people threw so much money that the Patreon was beyond 2 hours, they just have to reschedule the other stuff and not allow those things to happen. But for the time being, I'm going to say goodbye to chat. I'm glad to give you a forum where you guys can get together and be talking about all this wacky stuff. That's great stuff. And goodbye for today. I'll see if I can't do some cool jamming, and I will have another plugin this coming Sunday and another chat coming up this coming Monday. So I will see you then. Bye-bye.